Go.
Hello and welcome to Writer Mother Monster. I'm your host, Laura Ehrlich, and our guest tonight is Anne Hood. Before I introduce Anne, I want to thank you all for tuning in and let you know, as always, that you can now listen to Writer Mother Monster as a podcast on all major audio platforms or read the interview transcripts all on writermothermonster.com. And if you enjoy the episode, please consider becoming a patron or patroness on Patreon. Your support helps make this series possible. And remember to chat with us during the interview. Your comments and questions will appear in our broadcast studio and we'll weave them into our conversation. And now I am very excited to introduce Anne. Anne Hood is the New York Times bestselling author of 14 novels, 4 memoirs, a short story collection, a 10-book series for middle readers, and 1 young adult novel. Her essays and short stories have appeared in journals, magazines, and anthologies like the Paris Review, Plowshares, and Tin House, and she is a regular contributor to the New York Times op-ed page, Home Economics column. Her most recent work is Kitchen Yarns, published with W. Norton and Company, and she's a faculty member in the MFA and Creative Writing program at the New School in New York City. She lives in Providence, Rhode Island, with her husband and their children, and she describes writer motherhood in 3 words as best thing ever. Now, please welcome me in joining Anne Hood.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, this is fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm so thrilled to finally have a chance to speak with you. I told you when I invited you to come on as a guest that I remembered you so well from Breadloaf and just some of the amazing lectures and talks that you gave there that touched on motherhood and writerhood. So we'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. But first, we were chatting before the interview just about what life is like for you right now during this pandemic. And fill us in. Where are you? Where are your children? Tell us.
Yeah, so we're in Providence, Rhode Island. We've been here pretty much since March 12th. I was telling you earlier that we have an apartment in New York, and I spend about half my time there. And my husband and I had tickets to the Lehman trilogy, the play, and we'd been waiting for like months for this show. And my son, who lives in Brooklyn, called to see what we were doing that night. And I said, "Oh, we're going to see the Lehman trilogy." And he said, "Mom, Broadway just closed." And I was like, "Oh no, we've got to get out of here." So we left thinking we'd be gone 2 weeks or something, and here we are. I'm going back this weekend for the first time since March 12th. So I'm really excited. I just want to eat take out Chinese food and walk around my city. So we were here, and then we had the opportunity to relocate for 3 months to a tiny beach town in Massachusetts that nobody knows about, and there's no people there, and beautiful beaches and wildlife and stuff. And so we were there for 3 months. I think that was that saved us during the long year it's been. And we moved back here in November, and just waiting to get our jabs and start slowly re-entering the world like everyone else.
Oh, yeah.
And my daughter's with us. She's 16. She's a junior in high school.
Yeah. And your son is 23? Is that right?
Oh, no, he's 27.
Oh, 27. Oh, my gosh.
He's like a grown-up, and he lives in Brooklyn.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, wow. So we were talking again a little bit beforehand about what it's like having your 16-year-old daughter home with you during this pandemic. And how has that been? What has her experience been like through your eyes?
Yeah. So, I think I feel probably worse than she does because she doesn't really realize all the stuff she's missing. But I so loved being 16 and just being with my girlfriends and being silly and going to the beach, and you learn how to drive and sleep over each other's houses and eat lots of pizza. So I feel bad that she's not having any of those experiences. I'm really grateful that there's technology, something I typically try to keep her off of screens a lot, but they're able to FaceTime as a group, and they have their way of sort of hanging out. She's in school all remote, and it's just a weird experience to do high school from bed. It's just like,
Oh my gosh.
pretty much what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a completely different experience than I'm sure she ever expected to have.
Yeah. And it's junior year, so I'm really hoping that we're able to look at colleges, in the summer and fall. So I have all my fingers crossed that it sort of starts to open up so that we feel safe doing that. Because, some kids have had to pick colleges online, and I want her to have the experience of stepping onto the campus. When I brought my son, there were several times where we were in the parking lot and goes, nope, don't like it. So there's some vibe you get, and I want to make sure she has that opportunity.
Yeah, that's so true, how you can make those snap judgments at that age. Yeah. Tell me a bit about yourself then at 16. What kind of 16-year-old were you?
I was, and probably still am, like the epitome of the good girl. Like, I never got in trouble. I never drank. I was the president of everything. I was in every high school play. I was the editor of the newspaper and the yearbook. And I was just that like a little bit like Reese Witherspoon in election. I just wanted to do everything, and had a big group of friends that I'm still friends with. And wanted very dreamy too, though. I wanted to be a writer, and I liked being on the stage. And I worked as a model for the Jordan Marsh department store. You're from Connecticut, so you may remember that was an old New England store. So all through high school, I modeled for them. So I traveled a lot so I had this other separate group of my modeling friends, and we traveled all over doing fashion shows and teas with like old kind of waspy women, and we would model different clothes for them to buy, like showing the new fashions. That was funny. So I was busy. I was like that busy kid. I never had a minute, where I wasn't doing something.
I can identify with that, definitely.
Yeah, you that way too, a little bit, yeah.
Oh yeah. What were your parents like? What, especially, particularly your mother? What was she like?
I am blessed. I had like the best parents in the world. My mom just died almost 3 years ago now. She was 86, so I had her for a good long time, but not long enough. So my mom was from a immigrant Italian family, one of 10 kids, and they were all born in the house where I grew up. So my great-grandmother bought that house in a little town in Rhode Island in like the 1880s. And the family just never left. All that happened is the oldest person would die, and the next oldest would move into the better bedroom. That just kept happening. So I grew up with a lot of relatives, big, noisy house. My mother worked, so she had dropped out of school when she was 16 when her dad died. She had to work to help support, chip in with the family. She went back and got her high school diploma and went to college when I was a kid, and worked for the IRS as a tax auditor. And I still will be somewhere in Rhode Island, and I can tell if someone had a good audit or a bad audit by how they say, I knew your mother. It's like, I knew your mother. It's like, I knew your mother, so. And my dad was from the Midwest, and he was a career Navy man. So we moved around a lot until I was about 10. Yeah, and then he retired from the Navy and got a job in Boston. And so we moved in with my grandmother, who we lived with, for most of my life. Yeah.
No, I think anyone who's read your books can tell that family is vital to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was the kind of kid who, like if I got invited to do something on Sunday, I would rather be home with my family than go out with friends or, even dates. I just liked family. We always had a big, like we called it supper, but it was lunch. No, we called it dinner, but it was lunch. And then we called dinner supper. So we would have a big dinner at like 2:00 with all the Italian food and all the Italian relatives. The house wasn't that big, so it'd be like groaning and, bursting at the seams, not enough chairs. And I have 21 first cousins on my mother's side and 24 on my father's side.
Oh my gosh.
And so I know. So my dad's side was all in Indiana, so I only saw them every couple of years. But my cousins that I grew up with in Rhode Island, we were together all the time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, so family is just a through line, I think, in your work, and so is food. And
Oh,
I want to get to food a little bit too, but um, but first, you
definitely.
talked about your sense of adventure, I think, with modeling and
Yeah.
traveling and meeting people. And I know you then went on to be stewardess, right, for the airline.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about that decision.
So,
What led you there?
I grew up, my dad came from a small kind of farm town in Indiana, and he had just a dream of traveling and seeing the world. So he joined the Navy when he was quite young. And I grew up listening to his stories about like how he learned to ski in Greece and what it was like in Haiti. And my parents, before I was born, lived in Naples, Italy for like 3 years. So they had all these like great stories. So I think my love of travel just came from his wanderlust and sort of living vicariously through his adventures. My mother did not like traveling. She was a real homebody. And so when I was in high school and I was doing this modeling, I actually made kind of a lot of money. And my girlfriend Nancy and I schemed up this plan to take the money and go somewhere. And so I asked my father if I could travel with Nancy, and he said, "Yeah, you can go anywhere but New York City. It's too dangerous," which is so funny, but it was like the 70s. And so Nancy and I went, and our old French teacher was a travel agent, and he booked us a trip to Bermuda. And we went by ourselves, and we had like the time of our lives. And from that time on, I always traveled with girlfriends or like my cousins or whatever. We still, before the pandemic, did like yearly cousins trips. So travel has just been something I always loved to do. And so it seemed kind of natural to become a flight attendant because, when you're an English major, I'm guessing maybe you were too, Laura, there's not tons of jobs for you. And I didn't want to be like a high school teacher or something. I wanted to be a writer. And I thought, well, if I'm a flight attendant, I will surely have adventures. It'll give me more things to write about. And so right out of college, I went to work for TWA. And I was a flight attendant for 8 years. And in fact, my new book that I'm working on is about being a flight attendant. It's a nonfiction book called Fly Girl.
Oh, I can't wait to read that one. So it did give you a lot to write about, it sounds like, that experience.
It was everything I hoped it would be. Like, I would have people say, "Oh, how can you do that job? And you're just a glorified waitress." I never saw it that way. I really liked people. I liked being on the airplane. And there was this wonderful thing of like, if I did a long flight, I might be with this 747 full of people for like 6 or 8 or 10 hours. But then when I got off that plane, I never saw them again. Unlike my friends who were working in banks or offices or, whatever kind of jobs they had, they worked with the same people every day. And if they didn't like them, they were stuck. But somebody could be kind of, obnoxious or whatever. And I'd be like, I'm never going to see them again. It doesn't matter. So, and I got to travel a lot and have a lot of fun adventures. So, and it actually helped me become a writer in a lot of ways. One is that you don't work a 9-to-5 job. So I would work 2 or 3 days and then have 3 or 4 days off. And so I had a lot of time to spend writing and I didn't get an MFA or anything, but I did take writing workshops and stuff. So it allowed me that opportunity.
What was your first novel like? The first one that you wrote, not the first one that you published. Did you have one that you shelved?
Shelved. It went into a dumpster on Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village. It was called The Betrayal of Sam Pepper. And I don't remember what this woman who was like my neighbor and also another flight attendant had done, but she kind of made me mad. And so it was sort of a revenge tale. I did everything a first novelist does, like the name in the book kind of rhymed with her real name. And I just changed different details. And I was handwriting it mostly on the airplane, in notebooks. And then one summer I said, I'm going to reread this and finish this book. I'm going to finish it. And I read like 40 pages. Like, this is the worst thing anyone's ever written. And I picked up all those pages and I walked outside and I threw it in the dumpster. And I went back upstairs and I started writing what actually did become my first book.
Oh my gosh.
So that was my starter book.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to the starter book.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's then whether you write the next one that counts.
Exactly. Or if you can let go of it. I find sometimes with students, they just can't let go of that first one. And I always tell them that story, like, it's okay. I kind of taught myself to write by writing that book.
Oh, tell me then go into that a little bit more, I guess. Like, why is it important to let go? How do you know when it's time to let go of a book that's not working?
I'm a firm believer, and I think this partially comes from being my own worst critic. And like, I wasn't someone who was sending out a lot of stories. I did write some stories, and that, before there was email and stuff, put them in this self-addressed stamped envelope and had little index cards that kept track, but in a very limited way. And so, and that was mostly because I didn't think what I was writing was publishable. I mean, I just held a very high bar. And so, I mean, in a way, I wish I had kept that terrible novel, because I would love to see how awful it is. If I read F. Scott Fitzgerald, it kind of sounded like that. And then, of course, it was the 80s, and I discovered Raymond Carver, so it completely changed. The tone changed, and all the people were different, and they were now like working class people. I just imitated everything I read, so it was just this big mishmash. But I would read, if I got stuck, I would read something. I would read a book, and I would write in the book, how the writer did it. And I just kept doing that. And then things that you're told in writing workshops, like start with action or whatever, I just figured that out by reading so many books, where I realized, oh, these mostly start in a scene with action, so I was very self-taught. I'm an autodidact, but I think if you're a reader, you kind of know when what you're writing is not so good.
Yeah, especially if you're holding yourself up to F. Scott Fitzgerald, right?
Oh, we all do, right?
Exactly. So you knew you wanted to be a writer. Did you know you wanted to be a mother?
I did not want to be a mother.
Really? Tell me about that.
And not for any reason, because as I said, I had a totally happy childhood. I just loved my 20s. I mean, I was like the happiest flight attendant. I was writing. I sold my book in my 20s. It came out. And I just couldn't see how kids would fit into my life. Mm-hmm. I had a long-term boyfriend who I adored. And there was we had this very sort of distant, fuzzy idea of having kids someday, but it wasn't like something we talked about a lot or planned, or I never had that thing with the biological clock ticking. Like, I just thought, I was just happy, Once I decided to have a baby, then I was all on board, and it wasn't a hard decision. Like, I guess the time was just right for me, Once I had one, I wanted like 5. I just loved it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting. I've heard from women who I've had on the show here who've had that biological clock, and those who, just like you, said, I was waiting for that to happen, and it just never did. And I was in that latter category too. I just never could figure out how a child would fit into a life as a writer too.
Yeah.
How did you find being a mother changed your experience of being a writer?
Well, I had no time. Biggest thing. Because I was a writer for so long, without children, I was used to just like doing whatever I wanted when I wanted. If I wanted to stay up all night writing, that was fine. If I wanted to not go out, lock myself away, for a few days and finish a project, that was fine. If I wanted to drink in the afternoon, that was fine. I mean, anything was fine. Yeah. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness, this is going to be a challenge. I had made a decision, when I decided to have a baby, that I wasn't going to be a parent who the baby sort of changed their life and dictated their life. I wanted kids to be part of the life I had built, because I thought I had built this really fun, exciting life, and I thought they should fit into it, not everything change for the kid. And I know a lot of people have different ideas, and that's all fine, but that's how I felt. And so from the time my son was a baby, I was taking him all over the world with me. I was taking him on book tours. The kids have had a pretty exciting childhood, or different, traditional in some ways, but different in other ways. But when I was in labor, I was judging the Barnes and Noble First Book Award. And so I guess I just said, well, these things have got to coexist. So I would put him in like those little chairs that you can kind of bounce. They bounce in them, and bounce it with my foot and like write my novels or essays or whatever I was working on. So he was just side by side with me being a writer.
Yeah, so stealing time where you can. Maybe
Yeah.
stealing's not the right word. Making time when you can.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I think too that I pretty quickly, once, he was past being a toddler and like he went off to 2 hours, 3 times a week school or something. I just retrained myself to write when those hours opened up. And I think so many women do that. I read an essay by Ann Tyler once in which she said that she would take her kids to school in her pajamas, get them out of the car and run home to write and then pick them up. And, all the other moms were like, are you still doing that writing thing? Because she wouldn't linger and chat and, but she knew she had like that many hours. And so I think a lot of women who are writers and mothers have learned to do that same thing. It's like nap time. Okay, I can write. Or, school, play date. Yes, have a play date. I can write for 3 hours or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And I asked you, so before the interview, I had asked if I might ask you a little bit about loss and grief, and that might be the good transition here to that. I know that you gave birth twice and you had a daughter named Grace. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Yeah, so the Grace and Sam were 3 years apart. She was one of those kids who make adults laugh because she had this very deep voice, very raspy, deep voice, and she had a very dark personality for a little person. She was this like pale blonde, big blue eyes, looked like a little sweet thing, and she was sort of like from the Addams family, She had dark personality. When she was 4, she found on my shelf a collection of Charles Addams cartoons. And she loved them and she memorized them all. And she thought they were the funniest things. And here's her big brother, like not really understanding, like, why is that funny? That's awful. Grace, that's terrible. I remember one of my uncles died and he was quite old and we were going to pay a visit to my aunt. And I said, okay, so when you see Auntie Angie, she's going to be really sad. So make sure you tell her that you're sorry. And Grace just completely flat voice. Well, I'm not sorry. I didn't kill him. Things like that. So she kept us laughing, My son still says she was the funniest person he knew. She also really loved the Beatles. I'm completely responsible for that because when I had Sam, I had never held a baby. I'd never babysat. I was on the younger end of all those cousins I mentioned. I have like dozens of cousins, but I was on the younger end. So I had never really been around babies until I had one. And it never occurred to me that there were like people, making songs for children, like Baby Beluga and things. I didn't know anything about that. So I always just sang Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel and Joni Mitchell, the things I liked. So the kids kind of grew up with that music instead of kid music, not on purpose. I wasn't trying to make a point or have them develop a taste. It was just all I knew. And she just loved the Beatles as much as I did. And so that was kind of our special thing. And she always loved like the really dark songs. It was so funny. She loved I Need a Place to Hide Away, which is a really kind of sad song, or Eleanor Rigby. Like she liked the dark ones. Yeah. She was also a little artist. She took drawing and painting classes at like an art studio from the time she was like 4. And she would just sit and draw. She was very like focused and, task oriented.
Oh, she sounds like such a character.
She was a character.
She really does. Yeah. And I know this is hard to tell. Well, it's hard for me to ask you about because I have a 4-year-old, as I mentioned.
Yeah,
but,
of course.
Yeah. But of course. But anyway, can you tell us what happened to Grace?
Yeah. So she, when she was 5, she got a form of strep. It's the same thing like strep throat causes, and everybody in her school had strep throat, and it was just kind of going around. But hers went rogue, and they call it galloping strep. It's actually what I believe Jim Henson of the Muppets also died of that. So what happens, it sort of bypasses your throat and it attacks your organs. I'm not sure that it was what caused rheumatic fever, but I think they're connected somehow. So basically it damaged her heart, but it all happened super fast. I mean, she got a fever and she died 36 hours later. And very, very typical with this, when strep does this, is you don't even take them to the doctors, because how many times kids get fevers and they're just kind of lethargic. But she was acting super weird. Like it was enough to have me kind of sit up and take notice. And when I called the doctor, she said, go to the ER, which was weird because it was during the day and she was in the office. And she later said, I could hear the panic in your voice and I knew something was really wrong. She wasn't diagnosed right away, but it really wouldn't have mattered. They kept her in the ER for kind of, they checked for like meningitis and pneumonia and all sorts of things. And then they said she was fine and they were going to keep her overnight for observation. And pretty quickly when she got into that regular room, she turned critical and they rushed her to the ICU, where we kind of stayed for a day and a half. They worked really valiantly to try to save her.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it was in 2002. And so that seems like as long ago as it was, but in many ways it still feels like it just happened. You know, it's a funny thing. It's with all loss, you know, you feel very present. But of course, I have a lot of moments where I'm writing a date or something and I realize how old she would be now. And it just takes my breath away, you know, to never know what she would have accomplished or become, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, tell me, so I know that you wrote a memoir about that. Well, to back up a little bit, there were a few years after that, right, that it was impossible to write.
I didn't write for about 2 years. And you know, I remember a really wise writer friend of mine said, of course you can't write because we write to make sense of things. And there is no sense to what happened, you know, and so your mind can't even try to make sense of it. I think too, it was a lot of it was just shock. You know, I don't remember a lot about that first year. And then another really wise friend of mine suggested I learn to knit. And like, I am such a type A personality, straight A student. The only class I could not do well in was home economics. Sewing, I couldn't make my wraparound skirt. So I, from the time I was 14, stayed away from anything crafty, you know. But I thought knitting, great. Anything to get me out of my head. Like, I need help. It's about 6 months after Grace died. And so I learned to knit and I became a obsessive knitter. I knit full-time for a year. I was a terrible knitter, but at least what I found was that I had to focus. And I think that kind of got my brain working again. And Tin House, the literary journal, they used to do special issues and they were doing one on the issue of lying. And I was just on their mailing list because I had published a couple essays or stories or something with them. And I get this call, you know, for submissions on lying. And I went out to dinner that night with a friend and I was just like, you know, I'm going to just block them. I'm not writing and I don't want people to ask me to write. He was like, well, they didn't ask you. They asked. So don't get carried away. But he said, I think you could write a lot about lying. And I said, sure. And he said, you know, every time we talk, you tell me about the things people say about grief that aren't true. And although I kind of dismissed it, I woke up that night and had this voice in my head, sort of like the things that weren't true. So I sat down and just wrote it and read it through once and sent it off and then went into a complete panic attack. Sent it to my friend, another writer friend, and she said, she very kindly called Tin House and said, if you're going to reject this, tell me and I'll do it for her, because she's very fragile. And he said, I just read it, we're taking it. So that ran in Tin House. And very quickly, I wrote an essay about knitting and grief that ran in Real Simple. And then I didn't write again for another year. So I wrote those 2 essays. And then I was knitting, which is pretty much all I did. I would take my son to school And I was determined for him to still have a happy childhood, although he was crushed. But I would, I went to all the things, the school, whatever's, and brought pizza and pizza day and did all the things. But whenever I didn't have to do that, I would just sit and knit and like grieve, really. And one day I was knitting and I thought, I wish I could teach everybody how to knit, because there would be no more war. Everybody would have lower blood pressure, and we'd all have mittens and scarves. Like, it would be great. It'd be the perfect thing. And then I laughed and I was like, oh yeah, like you could teach other people to knit. And I kept knitting. And then I thought, wait a minute, I could write a book that shows how knitting helps people.
Mm-hmm.
Not a nonfiction book, but a novel. And this idea just kind of like was spinning in my head, like the spin cycle in your washing machine. And I called my agent and I said, I'm going to write a novel. And she started to cry. She said, I knew you would write again. What's it about? And I said, knitting. And there was this giant pause. And she said, people knitting for like 300 pages. And I said, she's like, okay. And I felt, even though it was such a half-baked idea, I just felt on fire that I could write this. And I sat down and I wrote all the ways, all the sort of facets of grief. I just kind of like, wrote them on these Post-it notes. And then I looked at them all and I chose the ones that I thought were the most interesting. And then I created a character to sort of reflect that emotion. So I had hope and love and resignation and regret, and then I made up characters to sort of personify those things. And that was the Knitting Circle. So I wrote that first.
I'm going to hold it up because I have all of them, but this one right next to me, the Knitting Circle.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember, so this was the talk that I remember specifically that you gave at Breadloaf, where you told us a variation of this story about losing grace and about finding your way back to writing through knitting. And then there was a moment, I think the moment in the talk where you said that she had died and that you had to sort of stop and catch your breath. And at the end, you said that moment never gets easier.
Right.
How do you, well, there's so many questions. How do you share, why do you feel that it's important to share that depth of grief with audiences? And how do you prepare yourself to actually speak those words that are so raw still?
Yeah. I guess there's a couple answers to that. The first is that I never thought I would write about grace. Fiction was one thing, because I changed so much. It's not really my story. It's a grief story, but I also see it as a story of friendship, because my friends lifted me up for years. They still continue to, those who were there with me. So I thought I would never write nonfiction about it. And I had written those 2 essays, and over the course of like writing the Knitting Circle, and when it first came out, I would have this idea about grief as if I had figured out one little tiny piece of it, and I would write an essay about that little tiny piece. And a couple of those essays won like pushcart prizes and things like that. And my agent and editor suggested that I collect them and like make them a narrative, not separate essays. And I said I didn't want to do it because I don't want to expose this, and I don't want to make money off Grace's death. And I had all these kind of ideas about why I didn't want to do it. And then they kind of let it go, and a few more months passed, or I don't know, some time passed, and we were having lunch together again, and they brought it up again. And when I was resistant, one of them said, you always tell us about the letters you're getting, the emails. And clearly you're reaching people with this. And something about that comment made me think about how I couldn't find anything that I wanted to read that helped me. And I was desperate. I tried everything. And I thought, wait a minute, if I write the book that I wish I had, then it might help people. And so that convinced me. And I had a fellowship set up to go to Yaddo. So I went with all these essays and figured out how to connect them and make it. And that book is Comfort. So that's the first question about how to, I never thought I would write about it. when I was going out on my book tour, so the Knitting Circle and Comfort kind of overlap, like the paperback came out of the Knitting Circle and then the hardcover. So this was like 3 years of pretty much talking about it. And I remember before I went on the book tour, my friend sitting me down and saying, "What are you going to do? Like, let's pick a section that you're going to read.
Yeah.
And you will always read that section." And I kind of read it over and over to myself so that it became, in a way, like reading the phone book, like they were just words. But a lot of that tour for those 2 books included grief groups and fundraisers for hospice centers and hospitals. And it was a lot of hearing a lot of people's grief stories. And it was really very, very hard.
Yeah.
And it just kept going, it just went on and on. And then finally things slowed down a bit and I could catch my breath. But then the story was out there, and so I found myself still being asked about it or talking about it. And I've completely changed from that first feeling I had, which is, I think I have had so many people, I mean, I don't know, definitely hundreds, maybe more, say, you're expressing what I don't know how to say. Like you wrote about something that I couldn't explain, or like people said, I gave this book to my mother or my friend or my husband, so they would understand what I feel. And so for me, that makes it worthwhile, although it's always hard. And often after I talk about it, I feel a little, weird or sad or something. But
Yeah, I know. And I'm sorry that we'll make you feel that way.
No, not at all. There's a funny thing, Laura. I don't think I've ever told this story before because I kind of pushed it to the back of my brain, I think. But we went to like Northern California we were just doing all kinds of things to try to feel better. And we went to Northern California, and I had this wonderful, ex-sister-in-law, I don't know, I still love her to pieces, but who lived there. And I was asking people if they could find a medium that was real, like not a phony baloney one. And she got me this appointment with this woman in San Francisco. And I remember going up these steps, like in the Mission or somewhere. And the woman was quite old and she was blind, and she would paint while she channeled whatever. And I mean, I like do love a lot of that stuff, but I was sitting there going, oh, this is not what I need. This is not going to make me feel better. And she looked up and she said, she didn't know anything about me, she looked up and she said, you are going to write something that is going to affect thousands and thousands of people. And I was like, I can't even put my pants on. Like, this woman's crazy. And she said, that's all I can tell you. You are going to give people a gift. She didn't even know I was a writer. And so I kind of pushed that away because I was so resistant when people would tell me, write it down. And when I couldn't write, it was so frustrating, And so I think I had her sort of in that category. But it's weird. I think that woman was onto something.
I think so too. Absolutely. Can you talk about finding a narrative in motherhood? Maybe starting with grief, but it doesn't have to. We can sort of move further out. But how do you find that narrative?
You mean in writing?
Writing, yeah.
It's so funny because before I had children, I still wrote about motherhood. Because I think I'm so family oriented, and I came from that big family, and the thing that interests me is relationships between mothers and daughters, sisters. I don't even have a sister, but women.
Yeah.
More than love stories. I like the women's stories. And so every time I would write a book, my mother would say to me, another bad mother. Everybody's going to think I'm the worst mother. And I'm like, they're not bad mothers. They're flawed. That's what we do. Then once I had kids, I'm not sure that it changed that much, except I was a better writer. And I think I could explore things more deeply anyway. So I find that lately I've been writing a lot about women who have given up children, or the novel I'm working on now, someone as a teenager gave up a baby. And so I think it's just one more way of looking at loss and grief without once again revisiting the story, you know?
Right. Well, yeah, and that touches on the fact that then you adopted a daughter, Annabelle, right?
I did.
Yeah.
That was like maybe top 3 decisions of my life. Yeah, I remember I was driving and Sam was in the back seat, and he used to love Transformers, and he had this thing called Optimus Prime. I don't know, you have a 4-year-old, so maybe not yet, but all these things they cost $1 zillion, you know, and they manipulate them all the time. I just want to like take it out of his hand. It would make me so nervous. But then it becomes a monster or whatever. So, and he would always have one of those. And it was kind of quiet. And I looked in the rear view mirror, and the thing was sitting on his lap, and he was looking out the window and he was crying. And he was like 10. And I thought, I am going to fix this family. And I felt like, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Raising Arizona, but Holly Hunter's like, I'm going to get me a baby. Well, I was like, a baby. I just had this like realization that one of the many wonderful things about babies is that they demand your attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't be so selfish and caught up in myself and my sadness. If there was a baby who needed to eat, who needed to smile, who needed, you know, whatever. And so we pretty quickly, from that day, I pretty quickly decided to adopt a baby from China. At the time, it wasn't easy, but it wasn't hard. You know, a lot of people were doing it. We had a woman in our neighborhood had done it, so we went and talked to her. And it took 9 months. It was funny. From when we went to the orientation until we went to China to get Annabelle. And she's from Hunan. She was 11 months old when we adopted her. And it's been the best thing.
Oh. Did adopting a child change your perspective on motherhood and writing about motherhood?
That's a really interesting question. People would ask me while we were waiting, like, how do you know this is going to work? Or what if this? And none of those questions came into my mind. I don't know. It was just sort of like when I got the idea, it just felt right. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we picked up the babies, we were traveling with maybe 10 families. And it was really interesting because many of those families already had children. So there were tons of kids. Sam was there and somebody else had 2 kids. And I mean, there was just like a bunch of kids. It was a big noisy bus, and we're on our way to pick up the babies. And it was in Changsha, which is like the capital of Hunan. And we were going to like a city hall. And, communist, like this gray, really ugly, nondescript building. Walked in and like lots of hallways and rooms and noise, and all you heard were babies crying. There were like, I don't know, 100 families picking up babies that day. Oh. And so we were ushered into this room to wait, and people went rushing past us down the hall. And I said, there went Annabelle. Like, a woman has there she is, because they had sent us a picture. And then not too long after that, they called us in, and they would just say, there were all these babies and all the parents, and they would just say, like, Anne or whatever, call your name, and you'd get up and they'd hand you this baby. It was so weird. But I remember they handed me the baby, and in like that moment, I had one thought: I would kill for this baby. I would do anything. Like, it was immediate. Yeah, this baby's my baby. Yeah.
Is that the same feeling you had when you had Sam and Grace?
I think so. I mean, I was so freaked out when I had Sam. First of all, he was born in like 20 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
So I was like, wait, I have a baby? I thought this was supposed to go on a little longer, and I was supposed to have some. Yeah, he was born really fast.
Oh, wow. And here you brought your manuscripts with you to read and everything.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was put in the hospital because they had detected some issue. So I was kind of there, and I was fine. I wasn't like, so I had to judge that contest. I think I even had to have, if it wasn't that day, it was like 2 days after I had him, I had to have like this call that Joyce Carol Oates was on. I was like, oh my God, this is getting so surreal. Because she was one of the judges. And yeah, so he had to be born fast. And so they had given me Pitocin, but it didn't work. Nothing happened. And so they're like, oh, we might send you home, but there might be this problem. So everybody was kind of talking and trying to decide it. I'm like, hours pass, like 6 hours. And all of a sudden I'm like, I don't feel very good. And then they're like, yeah. Well, should we send her? What should we do? Should we do another sonogram? Blah, blah. And I'm like, I really feel weird. And I remember the midwife looking and going, the baby's coming. And pretty much that was it.
Oh
So
my gosh.
I'm calling people from the hospital going, Sam is born. And they're like, wait, what? Yeah, it was funny. And
wow.
as I said, I'd never held a baby. Like I immediately felt like protective and in love. I mean, some people say, no, it took me a while to get to know them. I didn't have that feeling with my kids. I looked at them and I'm like, whoa, you are great, you know. But we taught each other a lot of stuff.
Yeah. No, I was in the same boat. I had held like one friend's baby once.
I
And
didn't like it, right? I remember somebody handed me a baby. I'm like, oh, I don't know.
yeah, it's like, I don't want to break it. I don't know what to do with it.
Up with that head. I did like it.
Yes. No, you definitely have to learn as you go, I think. Yeah. I'm ashamed to say I don't remember this, but did you ever write about birth?
I don't think so.
No.
There was a wonderful anthology, and I'm embarrassed that I can't think of the name of it, that Eleanor Henderson edited, wonderful writer, about people having babies, but I feel like I wrote about adoption.
Interesting.
And there was another one that Helen Schulman and Jill Bialowski edited many years ago when Sam was a baby. And it was called Wanting a Baby or Wanting a Child or something. And everybody wrote about wanting to have babies and, you know, infertility and all that. But I wrote about being a step parent. So I was in both those things, but I think I wrote about kind of off topics.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly.
Well, so what were your expectations of motherhood? And then tell me how that changed, how the reality of motherhood matched up with your expectations.
I kind of saw it as like a grand adventure,
Mm-hmm.
which I think it is. There were times, especially when Sam and Grace were little, like I can remember being in a Stop and Shop, like a grocery store, and they were just off the wall. I mean, they were just being bad and running, and they were those kids that like you stare at their mother. You know, they were doing the thing. And I remember thinking, no, this isn't what this is supposed to be. Like, I don't like this part. So, I mean, they were pretty much all good kids, and did what they were supposed to do, and were creative and fun. I had a lot of fun with them. But those moments when it wasn't that, I was like, this isn't what I signed up for. But mostly, I just always thought of it as an adventure. Like I have pictures from recently where my son comes home and they still all get in bed with me and we have coffee and, I don't know. It's pretty much what I'd hoped. I don't know if it's what I imagined, but it's what I hoped.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Here's a craft question for you that's hard to say. So I've noticed, especially with your lectures and your talks, that you choose an item often to focus the narrative around. There was this great talk that you gave at Tin House once about ostensibly about your brother, but it was about his car, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he had and that you and this relationship with his car. And then I remember at Redlow, you had this another talk at the end. I think it was the ending keynote talk about tomato pie, and that was really about it was your mother, right?
Yeah.
And about
yeah.
So can you talk about, just from a craft perspective,
Mm-hmm.
about why you made those choices? And I'll stop there. Why you made those choices?
So I think as writers, we do a lot of things unintentionally or accidentally. We're doing something right, but we don't know the name for it, or we couldn't really explain how we do it or why we do it. And at some point many years ago, I read an article. It was a T.S. Eliot essay about why Hamlet was a failure and Macbeth was a successful play. And it was kind of dryly written, but I just thought the idea was so interesting and what he was talking about. And he called it the objective correlative, which is using an object or an event to take the place of the emotion you're trying to write about. So, I mean, he said, Hamlet gets up there and it's like to be or not to be, and he just talks and he thinks out loud and he goes on and on. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth is washing her hands, and we all know guilt. And she doesn't need to talk and, pontificate about it. And he had other examples from the two plays, but that's the most obvious one. And so I just started reading more about that, and then looking at things I liked and seeing how it was used, and that whether writers did it intentionally or whether they called it that or whatever, it's a technique that I have found over and over just works, especially I found in essays. Mm-hmm. And so my brother's car was a Volkswagen Bug. This was like 1970. Everybody had them. Every teenager or a young person. They used to cost $1,200. And they came in great colors. They were like jelly beans, and but I started the essay the essay came about not because of my brother's car, because it was many years later, but it was because I saw an orange Volkswagen Bug and I just wanted to own it. And I don't like cars. I don't like driving. I like being in a car if I'm the passenger and I can knit or read or not have to focus, but I'm not like someone who loves cars. I don't know the difference between a Honda and a Toyota. They all look the same to me. It was just so weird that I saw that car and I was like, I want that car. And it was used, and it was $6,000, which is the exact amount of money I had to redo my kitchen, but I bought the car. And then I'm like, what is wrong with me? I have 2 kids. I couldn't barely fit the car seat in the back of a Bug. Poor Annabelle's legs were and I was like, what am I thinking? And I was like, I wasted money. And then I started kind of being, beating up on myself. And then one night, as I couldn't sleep over the $6,000, I remembered my brother's car. And I remembered how the summer he came home with that car and all his college friends came and they all had Volkswagen Bugs. And if one of them had to leave and he was blocked in, they would get up and just pick up the cars and rearrange them like pieces on a chessboard. But I remembered that there was so much more to that summer. I was like 12 or something. And those boys kind of I was their mascot. And they gave me books to read, and they'd come, and my brother wasn't home yet, and they'd hang out with me, and they'd take me for a frozen lemonade, or they taught me to play Frisbee. They'd take me to the beach. I just was a tag along, but they kind of liked talking to me, and one of them took me to see the play Hair. My father almost killed him because I was 12, and they get all naked in hair at the end. But I've always thought of that summer as the most special summer of my life in a way, because they opened my eyes to so many things. It was a very political time with the Vietnam War. They were all up for the draft. Lottery was that year. So I heard them discussing politics. It helped me form what I felt about politics and the country, where I landed on different issues and books and theater and all of it. So it was a very important summer for me. And so when I realized that, I'm like, that's why I bought that car. So the essay that came from that was called The Boys of Summer, and it was in the New York Times, and it was in the op-ed page. They used to run occasional essays on that page in the summer, and it was very summer focused. And the car that I bought is just the little bit at the end that I bought this car, maybe to feel the way I felt that summer again. Yeah. So that's a great example of the objective correlative, where a car stands in for that emotion of that magic of that summer.
Just unfolds from there into politics and puberty and all of these things. Is beautiful. Yeah. Shifting us back to motherhood for a second, because I feel like you've straddled such an interesting period of your son's 27 now, and then you have a 16-year-old daughter at home. Can you talk us through just how writing motherhood has changed and what it's like for you right now with a 16-year-old? Are you finding that you have a little more time to write, or are there different demands?
So my son, this is sort of a backwards way to answer your question, but my son, from the time he was 8, acted in community theater, semi-professional and professional theater. That kid was gone a lot. He did rehearsals and parents weren't allowed. And so he was the busiest kid because he was auditioning for one thing, rehearsing for another, in another play. He was in a traveling theater company that did musical fairy tales, and he'd go, like they played those giant open air theaters like on Cape Cod, and those things in the
Yeah.
and so they'd go, and a bunch of his friends were there, and he was young, and so he was gone a lot. And so I always felt I had a lot of time to write because I knew Sam's at rehearsal or whatever.
Mhm.
With the pandemic, I was home all the time with two middle-aged people, poor kid. But so basically it's when she's in school, I know I can sit down and write. And she doesn't want to always hang out with me. Like, she's great. Like, she always wants to have dinner with us. She loves playing games, cards and stuff with us. But she also like wants to go talk to her friends, as she should. I mean, I wish she could be out with them. And so I actually do have a lot of writing time. You have a 4-year-old. I don't know how that works, but I can remember when my kids were littler, I would say, you can't come in this room for like an hour.
Mhm.
If
Yeah.
I'm safe, I don't know, not like go do anything you want, but just don't come in here for 1 hour. And I used to like kind of take that time, but I think it gets easier when they're older.
That's what I've heard. How did it work when they were younger? When you, how do I put this question? I feel like women are still struggling to do that, to close the door and say, "This is my time." Right? Did you feel that conflict, or was it something that you? Yeah.
Yeah, Lara, I never did. I think it's because I was an established writer. Like, by the time I had my first kid, I already had written like 6 books or something.
Mhm.
And I had columns in magazines and I got a column in a magazine right after he was born about being a parent. Like, it was Parenting Magazine. So I was always working and I was doing what I had been doing. So I didn't, but I will tell you, you're saying something so true, and it makes me sad, but I have so many women students from places like Breadloaf or conferences all over, or just taking classes with me. And they just feel guilty writing. They don't think they've earned it because they haven't published yet.
Yeah.
It's like not there. I've had women tell me that their husbands have said, okay, for 1 year, and then if you don't finish it or the book doesn't sell, and we know that's not how writing works or publishing. It really makes me feel bad. And it makes me feel bad that in 2021, women are still feeling guilty about their dream or their work or their passion. I think that's sad. I never felt that. I was always, from when Sam was quite young, a firm believer in the babysitter. I found them. We lived right near Brown University, and they used to have like a board, and I took all those little things you rip off, called every kid as like, come. I need to work,
Mhm.
So there were periods of times where we had a couple live-in nannies, but always babysitters. I just loved it. And I think it's great for your kid to be with like a teenager. And to go play around with whatever they're doing and get out of the house with younger people. And I would say that we're still very close to probably 60 or 70% of those babysitters we've had over all these years.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. No, sorry. Go ahead.
Just the other day, Sam's first babysitter, who babysat him for many years, said, "Oh, I'm cleaning out some stuff, and I just found these pictures, and they're pictures of her and Sam like painting their faces or something, and he's little, I just think it expands the kid, I mean, I have friends who their child never had a babysitter, never.
Mhm.
And I'm like, whoa, first of all, how do you do that? I guess I'm kind of selfish, and maybe again, it's because I had kids when I was slightly older, but it's like, I wanted to go to the movies, and I wanted to go to see a play or for a weekend somewhere. So I don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, that's all important to do, right? I think you made some really important points to echo. One is that it expands a child's world, right? To have more than just their parents watching. I mean, I told you before the interview, my daughter spends a lot of time with her grandparents, and I struggle with some guilt where I'm like, my parents are watching her for quite a lot of the day, but she's so happy and they're happy, so
Oh, I
why I
think
feel
our children are a great gift to our parents. That
hmm
is really true. My dad was Sam's first babysitter, and I used to teach in New York. I was teaching at NYU, and so I think it was a Tuesday class. I would take Sam to his little nursery school. He was like 2, 3, something like that. And then I would go to New York, and my class was at 4 or 5, and I would spend the night, come back the next day. My dad would pick him up at school, and he'd spend the night with my parents. And like, they didn't want to relinquish him.
yeah,
When I'd go back, they're like, "Oh, you're back already?"
yeah, it's true. You can leave the baby. You don't need to be here. Yeah.
But that is such, again, a gift for your children because, somebody told me once, you should have you should have a friend from every decade.
Oh,
And, if your parents are in their 60s or 70s and they've got a friend who's 4, I think that's pretty great.
yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
And then I know we're approaching the hour, but I just also want to echo the other thing that you said, which was that in hearing you talk about your writing, you refer to it as your work, and you
Yeah.
close the door. I'm working,
Yeah.
and I think that's valuable for listeners to hear. Is that um, and I feel this conflict too, where when I'm doing my day job and I'm making that paycheck and I have deadlines and all of these things, it is much easier to close the door and say I have to do work
Yeah.
because that is by society considered work.
Hmm.
Whereas when I close the door and say I'm working on a novel that may or may not ever sell and might not get finished, and
Right.
then it's easier to dismiss it as your hobby or your
Yeah.
passion or whatever, and not worthy of closing the door for. So what would you say to that?
Well, no, I totally hear what you're saying, and I know so many women have that conflict.
Yeah.
But I think that work and your passion doesn't always make money. Like it's what I think we will not be valued unless we value ourselves and what we're doing.
Mhm.
And I just always valued that time. Thank you. I always valued that time and saw the value in it. And it's like I had said earlier, I used to take my kids on book tours with me because I wanted them to see what I do. I wanted them to see that people show up to live, that when I go and say I'm doing this thing, even if it isn't in a magazine or doesn't become a book, I go places and I sign the books I do have, and people come and talk to me. And, sometimes there's 4 people in the room and sometimes there's 400 people, whatever. But I always wanted them to see it until they reached a point. Annabelle's there, like, are you going to do that one talk again? I'm not going. But it's just always been important that they value what I do. But if you don't value it, and the only way you cannot value it, not you personally, but anyone, is by not by thinking of it as a hobby or something not worthwhile. But if you see
Yeah.
it as worthwhile, then it is.
Yeah. And the last question I have, which you just touched on, is I've had women on who have younger kids with,
Mhm.
4 or even younger, a couple months old.
Yeah.
And when asked that question, what do you want your kids to think of your writing someday, or to see, how do you want them to see you as a writer and a mother? It's a very aspirational
Yeah.
question for them, but you can actually ask your kids, or what your kids think of you as a writer and a mother. So what do they think?
Okay, so I think my son completely loves that I'm a writer because it allowed him to pursue acting. I never once where it's like, you can't major in theater or you're wasting your time or that's your hobby. Like he wanted to be an actor. I got it because I'm an artist too. And so I think it allowed him without any, he was shocked when someone said to him once, your mother's going to let you major in theater in college. He was like, I couldn't imagine that someone wouldn't. So I think it really, it's very fun, actually. Sam and I and his girlfriend did a project during the pandemic, during the summer, where we recorded writers' craft talks and started a company called Craft Talks, where you can buy these 6 unlimited access to these 6 writers, Andre Dubus III and Laura Lippman, and so we did that to 6 of us, and we did it together because he knew how frustrated I was that I couldn't teach in person. and that my friends and other writers I respected couldn't. So I think he gets it. All of that said, he's never read anything I've written.
Really?
No.
Wow.
And I teach typically, not for this summer or last summer, but in Ireland at a wonderful writers conference there. And he has come a couple times. And I read an essay that I had read before, but it was about Grace. And it slayed him. And he said, "This is why I can't read your stuff." So he has no interest. Annabelle reads things. She edits and she's brutal. So, so she's like, I just read the first 5 pages. I wouldn't read this book. It's not exciting. It's not interesting. And I'll be like, wait. But then she'll sit down and she can back it up. And so she's a great editor, great person to, run ideas by. And when Kitchen Yarns came out, she's in a couple of the essays. She went right to those and read them, so she reads them. And she doesn't want to be a writer, but maybe, but I think they appreciate what I do. I hear them when they introduce me to their friends, whatever, that they're proud because they know that it's hard to be a writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That you sit with nothing and you make something.
Yeah, and it sounds like you really let them into that process and took them along with you, so they have a respect for it.
Right.
Yeah. Do you feel like, or has Annabelle said that she's gotten to know a different part of you through reading your writing?
She hasn't said that. No, she has said, "Oh, I didn't look at that way, or I didn't see it that way." But not that it was wrong, or because she's read my kids' books because the age when I was writing them matched her age, and she gave me some good ideas to add in there.
Yeah.
But no, she's just pretty blunt about it, which is good.
Yeah, everyone needs a good editor.
Or like if I'm writing, so in Providence we live in a loft, so it's just completely open. The bedrooms have doors, but there's no place to go. No, the bedrooms have doors. There's no place to if we're not in our bedrooms, we're all in the same big loft area. But I'm writing at the table. And she comes out of her room and she'll look and read. "Oh, what is this? No, is this the novel? Oh, that's good. That's interesting." Like she'll read, so she's interested in process.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. What does she want to be, if not a writer?
She loves languages. So she went to a French school, like a French lycée. So she's fluent in French.
Oh, wow.
She takes Italian now. And so she has toyed with the idea of doing something with languages, but she also loves science. So she's thought about translating science stuff. Liberal arts.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Those are the things she likes. She also loves math.
Did you love math?
I remember when I was knitting something once, and it involved like counting and subtracting, and I looked at my knitting teacher and I said, "You never told me math." I would not have started that. I know, sometimes even simple math, I'll sit and do it over and over and still get it wrong, and I'm like, oh. Yeah.
Oh, me too.
You too.
I know. Oh, totally.
That doesn't work for me.
Yeah, no. I tried to tutor children once after school, and I thought it would be all language arts and history, and I had to help someone with math. I was trying to help a second grader with subtraction, and I couldn't do it.
No, I'm with you. I think it was just this morning. I was reminding Annabelle how when she was little, she used to always say, "I don't want to go. Can you homeschool me?" And I'd say, "I can't, because you have to be socialized and you have to learn math. So you must go to school."
Sounds like that was a good decision. And I'll end just with a comment here from some of our listeners. So you have Trudy here who says you have amazing children. And
Trudy knows them too.
It sounds like it. Yeah. And I'll share a few others. You can read them after. But I agree. A friend from every decade is, for me, one of the best takeaways. So let's all cultivate that.
Yeah, definitely.
But thank you so much, Anne, for coming today and for sharing your stories with us and for going into some difficult subjects. And just for your honesty and openness. I really
Laura, it
appreciate it.
was so great talking to you. Thank you so much for having me, and I really
Oh,
enjoyed it. The time flew by.
it really did.
Uh,
Stick around after, and I'll just be able to say goodbye. But
okay,
first, I just want to thank everyone else for joining us too. And you can watch this video again, listen to the podcast, or read the interview transcript on writermothermonster.com. You can also find all of Anne's books on the bookshop link that is on the writermothermonster.com website, as well as the books by all of our other authors for sale as well. And just a reminder, if you enjoyed the conversation, to please consider joining the community as a Writer Mother Monster patron or patroness on Patreon. So thank you all again, and I'll see you next week. And Anne, thank you. It's been a
thanks,
pleasure.
Laura. Thank you, everybody, for listening in.